In today's video, I'm going to walk you through the amazing pencils brush pack for Procreate. We're going to walk through the brushes in detail. If you're interested, please keep on watching. Hello and welcome to Color with Kendi. So today's video is part 2 of the series on the amazing pencils brush pack. I highly suggest that you watch part 1 first because we talked about a lot of different things that I won't be repeating in today's video. In part 1, we did a brief walkthrough of the files that you get with this set. We also talked about pressure sensitivity, tilt sensitivity, preset sizes, dual color pencils, layering, smudging, and a lot more. So that video is meant to be the foundation, and today's video as well as part 3 are meant to be add-on videos where we talk through the details. So if you have not watched part 1, check out the link in the description as well as a pinned comment. If you've already purchased the set, please open up the brush tutorial canvas. We'll be using that today. If you don't have the set yet and you are curious to learn more, you can find a link in the pinned comment. Okay, so let's open up the brush tutorial canvas. This is where we're going to test all the brushes. And in the layers panel, you'll see different layers for all of the brushes. We're going to work our way through this. So I wanted to mention that today's video is a screen recording. I know for some people that feels a little bit daunting, but I am going to walk you through every single step. The reason I decided to do a screen recording for today is it is a lot easier to see the details of the brushes and the differences between them on the screen recording. So the first brush we're going to test out together is brush number 6. So we're going to start with the sketching pencils, and then we're going to do brush numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 a little bit later, possibly in part 3 of this series. So the sketching pencils, let's open those up. So there are 3 different sketching pencils and they have slightly different textures. So let's tap on brush number 6. This is the soft sketch pencil. Now, when it comes to using these brushes, I would suggest to use them at a smaller size because they look a little bit more like pencils. If you start to go a little bit too big, they don't look accurate. So I'm going to select a color from the color menu. I'm in disc mode, and I'm not going to go with black. I want to go with a really dark gray. So black is right here, if you can see, and I'm just moving it to very dark gray. So just select a dark gray and let's test out that color. That way it looks more like a pencil. And you can use it with any color, of course, but I prefer to use it with dark gray. So with light pressure, that is what that brush looks like. And if I start to increase the pressure, as you can see, the color is getting a little bit darker. So there is a setting in this brush which makes the color change just a little bit depending on the pressure. Not too much, just a little bit. And if you use really heavy pressure, which I don't suggest you do, the brush looks very different. So as you can see, it looks much darker. So with the brushes in the Amazing Pencils brush pack, I highly recommend staying between the low pressure and medium pressure zone. I rarely use high pressure because it actually puts a lot of pressure on your hand to use things with high pressure. So low to medium is where you're going to get the best results. Now you can always change your pressure curve if you need to. I talked about this in the last video. There is a video on how to change the pressure curve. So if you feel like you need a different pressure curve than the default, you can definitely do that. But this brush is meant for sketching. So if I use light pressure to sketch a shape, it would look like that. And if I vary the pressure, I'll get a little bit of difference in the value of the color. So that is brush number 6. This is usually the brush I will use for sketching. And I will also sometimes tilt it. So if I'm sketching a circle, let's say, then I'll kind of tilt it a little bit to get a little bit of shading. Do you see? You can do that too. So with tilt, it has a slightly lighter texture. It's more grainy. But without tilt, it's less grainy. So that is brush number 6. It's a great sketching pencil. So now let's talk about brush number 7. This is toothy sketch pencil. So this is toothier, which means it's going to have a lot more of the grain of the paper show through. So I'm using this one at size 15. So that is light pressure. And that's medium pressure. So as you can see already as a comparison, this brush number 7 is toothier. It's got more of the white of the paper peeking through compared to the other one. Now if I use really heavy pressure, it actually is not as dark as brush number 6. There's not as much color shifting that happens with brush number 7, and there's still a little bit of the grain of the paper peeking through. So essentially brush number 6 and 7, it totally depends on your style, and maybe it depends on your illustration too. You may choose one over the other. And I'm going to go now to size 30. Let's zoom in now. And so if I sketch with this one, it has a slightly different feel than brush number 6. But both of them are similar, it's just one is toothier than the other. And you can use this for sketching, but also you can use it for coloring. There's no reason why you can't use this for coloring, you certainly can. So if I went in and selected, let's say, blue, you can use this brush for coloring as well, like that. Okay, so now let's go on to brush number 8. This is actually the pencil that I use the most. If you have any of my coloring pages, but more recent ones, this is the one that I use. I like the texture of this one. I'm going to go back to that gray color that I had, and I am using size 20. So this one, light pressure, it looks like that. Heavy pressure to light, it looks like that. And this one is really sensitive to your pressure. Like the size of the line will shift depending on how much pressure you apply. And that's why I love this brush so much, because if I'm making a shape and let's say I'm making a flower petal, I can create something like that where you've got some thin areas, some thick areas. It is very pressure sensitive. And there's also tilt in this brush too. So this brush is definitely different from brush number 6. So this one I generally use for my line work for my coloring pages because I really like that texture. It's a little bit rough. I actually don't like line work that has no texture. I just love texture. So I use it for that, but you can also use it for sketching. And so if I sketch with this, let's see, make a circle. You can also use it for sketching. But I generally use this one for line work. And you can also color with this too. Now this one, if you use really heavy pressure, what will happen is you will get pretty much no texture in the center. So you will only get the texture, that rough edge. So sometimes if you want to fill in a shape with a rough edge and you want it to be flat inside, this is a good brush for that. So as you can see, you've got that rough edge, but it's completely flat inside if you use heavy pressure. Now, if I use light pressure to color this in, like let's say make a heart and use light pressure, light and medium, you create something that looks very different, right? So this compared to this, so it's the same brush, it's a different technique. So with all the brushes in the set, it's all about playing around with that pressure, light pressure and medium pressure. Ideally, heavy pressure can be used, but you will get very different results. So those are these sketch pencils, and you do not need to use them only for sketching. You can color with them too, but these are generally the ones that I will use for sketching, and I really love brush number 8 for line work because it has this subtle texture on the edges. So those are the sketch pencils, and now let's move on to the next segment. Okay, so I'm going to go to the layers panel, and I'm going to turn off the sketch pencils just by tapping on that little checkbox there. And then I'm going to tap on the monoline pencils layer and make sure it's turned blue, and then tap on the little checkbox there. So now that layer is on, and let's paint in this layer. So now we have 4 pencils here, and they are the monoline pencils. You might be wondering, what's a monoline pencil? So the previous sketch pencils, depending on how much pressure you applied, the line width did shift, especially with number 8. It became thin and thick, right? The monoline pencils do not change in line width. They remain the same width. So that's why it's monoline. It's the same width across. And there are 4 different ones, A, B, C, and D, and they're all sort of similar, but slightly different. So I'm going to show you each one, and then I'm going to talk about why I created the monoline pencils and what I would use them for. So let's take brush number 9. I'm going to use the same color, that dark gray that we had. I'm going to zoom in so you can see things a bit better. And I am currently on size 15. So for this pencil, if I use light pressure, this is really light pressure. It looks like that. Medium pressure, heavy pressure. So do you see, even though I've changed my pressure, my line has not become thicker. So that's what I mean by monoline. And there is no tilt function to this because I don't want to add a tilt function to something that was meant to be the same line width across. So just keep in mind that these brushes, the monoline pencils, are not tilt sensitive. The other ones were. So what would I use a monoline pencil for? Handwriting text. So if I were to handwrite text, like let's just say hello, right? That looks natural. That kind of looks like what I would expect it to look like if I was writing with a pencil. Now, if I handwrite with, let's say, brush number 8, I'm just going to show you. If I don't use the same pressure throughout, which I generally don't end up doing, I do change my pressure when I make lines, it kind of looks weird. So that doesn't work. I can make it smaller. That looks a little bit better, but as you can see in this hello versus the hello up here at the top, there is that line width that's changing. So if you like that look, that's great. I think changing line width is great for text like this, where you want the line width to change. So for something like that, I would use brush number 8. But if I don't want the line width to change and I want it to remain like this, the monoline pencils are really great for that because it depends on your illustration. Sometimes you just want the same width line, use the monoline pencils. And you could color with these too. There's really no reason why you can't color with them. I'm using medium pressure here, but I didn't design these for that. I designed this for line work that needed the same width across. And if you use really heavy pressure, it looks like that. So you still have some textures not completely flat. Okay, so now let's move on to brush number 10. So now that you know how a monoline pencil works, they're all kind of similar in terms of how they work. So I am going to go to brush size 30. So this is light pressure, medium pressure. It's a little bit less grainy, less of the grain of the paper peeking through. And then with heavy pressure, it's not that different. So this one is not as sensitive to pressure as this one. So this one we saw a huge difference between the light pressure and the heavy pressure. With this one, there's less of that difference. And there's a little bit more of the grain of the paper peeking through. So if I write hello with this, that's what it looks like. So this one looks a little bit less, it looks a little bit transparent in areas, if you can see that. This one does not. So slightly different texture, and you can also color in with this too. Definitely has, that's medium pressure and that's heavy pressure. So there's not that much difference between the medium and heavy here. And as you can see, a lot more of the grain of the paper peeking through compared to this one. So that is brush number 10. Now, brush number 11, monoline pencil C. This one's interesting. So this one was supposed to mimic a freshly sharpened pencil. So, you know, sometimes you have a freshly sharpened pencil and there's like little bits of that graphite coming off on the side. That's kind of what this is meant to mimic. Now, if you haven't really experienced that, then you might be wondering, why does this pencil look like this? It's for a specific reason. So anyway, I am at size 20. And this one looks far better at a smaller size. I find the bigger you go, it just doesn't look natural. So this one at a small size, that is light pressure. Well, that wasn't very light. This is light pressure. That was medium. And then this is heavy. So do you see there's like a little bit of texture to one side of the line? That's what it looks like when you use a freshly sharpened pencil. It doesn't last very long with a pencil. Like, freshly sharpened is just for a couple minutes and then it's not freshly sharpened anymore. So that is what this pencil is supposed to mimic. I don't like coloring with this one. I find that this one is not that great for coloring. You get something like that. This is really good for line art and for, you guessed it, handwriting. So I would use this for line work, not for coloring. Every brush has some advantages, some disadvantages. I don't think this is a great one for coloring, but if you like that kind of line, like a freshly sharpened line, this is the brush for that. Now, if I go really big, which I suggest you don't do, it looks like that. I don't think it looks as natural. It doesn't really look like a pencil anymore. But you can still use it. It's just, it's not the intended result. I do think this works best at the smaller size. Okay, so now let's go on to brush number 12. So this is monoline pencil D. So I am currently at size 25. So that's light pressure, medium pressure, heavy pressure. Very minimal difference between the pressure, and it's the same width across. And you can also color with this. Slightly different texture than the other ones. And if I write hello with this one, that's what it looks like. So I'm using the exact same color for all of these pencils. So as you can see, this one has more gray in it. It's not as dark. It's a little bit more transparent in certain areas compared to this one. So that's the thing. They're all monoline. They all behave the same, but they all have different textures. And the one you pick really depends on your style. Just because there are 4 brushes, you do not need to use all 4 brushes. It is a matter of preference. So I wanted to give you options. You pick the one that suits your style and maybe that suits your illustration. So these are all the monoline pencils. So let's move on to the next segment. Okay, so now we're going to go back to the layers panel. We're going to turn off that checkbox from the monoline pencils, and then we're going to tap on thin and thick pencils. Make sure that layer turns blue, and then tap on the checkbox so we can see all of the brush numbers. Okay, so we have 5 brushes here. So these are thin and thick pencils. So you might be wondering why they called thin and thick pencils. Because they are highly pressure sensitive. They are not monoline anymore. Your pressure will impact how thin and thick these are. And these are wonderful for doing line work that has a little bit of texture. So let's start out with brush number 13, which is thin and thick tapered pencil A. So whenever there's a brush that has a taper, it's important to really vary the pressure as you move off the screen. So I'm going to explain that. So let's just test this brush out together, same color. So I am currently on size 25 and this is light pressure. So far, it's not looking that different from the other pencils. This is heavy pressure. So now we're really seeing the difference. Do you see how much of a difference there is between light and heavy in terms of the width? We did not see that with the other pencils in this set so far. So this one is very sensitive to pressure. So what I suggest to get the most natural results is to vary your pressure slowly. So for example, if I were to go like this, light to heavy, it looks unnatural, right? It doesn't look right. So with this brush, it's really important to have a very slow transition. Well, not very slow, but slower than what I did here. So you would go light to heavy and something like that. Less of a drastic transition. So for this, brush control is really important. And I suggest that you practice your brush control by doing exercises like this, where you go thin to thick, thin, thick, thin, thick. That really helps you practice brush control. So anyway, what would I use this brush for? I would use it to create line art. You can also use it for sketching. There's no reason why you can't use this for sketching, but I don't find that it's as good for sketching as the sketch pencils, but this is really good for line art. So if you want your line art to be thin and thick, certain areas are thin, certain areas are thicker, you can create that sort of look. Now, if I did the same star with one of those monoline pencils, I just want to show you, it would just create a different look. Do you see? It's a different vibe. So I think the thin and thick pencils are more my vibe. I actually prefer to use those, but it depends on the illustration. So it's really great for doing some line work. You can also color with these pencils, but there's not that much texture. So for coloring, I wouldn't suggest these pencils. I do think they're better for line work. Where this brush really shines is its ability to create thin and thick lines like this, but you have to vary your pressure. If you use the same pressure throughout, then you will get something like a monoline pencil. Now, this is a tapered pencil. So in order to get the taper, what's important to do is you start out with light pressure, get into heavier pressure, and then release your pressure as you move off the screen. Again, this is something that requires good brush control, which sometimes as a beginner is really hard to do, which is fine. With practice, you will be able to do this. It's all about varying the pressure and making sure that your pressure is released as you move off the screen. So let me show you that again. So basically, as I'm moving off the screen, I'm reducing my pressure and I have a lot of control there. Now, if you don't do that, then it will look like that. You won't get that taper. So if you don't want the taper, let's say you're using the brush and for a particular stroke you don't want the taper, just use the same amount of pressure throughout the stroke. If you want the taper, reduce your pressure as you move off the screen. So I wanted to show you a real life example of how I would use this brush. So I have a few illustrations here, which I made with different brush packs, but I generally like to add a little bit of pencil on top afterwards. So this is an illustration that I made with the amazing watercolor brush pack. And one thing that I could do is add a little bit of an outline to some of these trees. So I'm just going to show you that as an example. So I'm going to zoom in here and show you with this tree. So I'm going to grab this color here, and then I'm on brush number 13 from the pencil set. And what I could do is I could add an outline, maybe something a bit darker actually. Let's see, test the color. Still not dark enough. Gotta test, yeah. So I could go in starting here and then use thin and thick lines to create that outline. So do you see? It's now, it kind of looks like it's almost like a shadow on that one side. So because I'm able to vary the pressure, it looks more interesting. If I use the same amount of pressure throughout, it wouldn't look as interesting. So that's kind of what I would use the thin and thick pencils for, creating that line work that has a subtle texture that goes well with other things. It can go well with watercolor, gouache. You can even do your entire illustration with pencils too. So that is one example of what I would use this brush for. So I'm going to go back here and now let's breeze through the rest of these pencils. So number 14, thin and thick tapered bead. This one has the least texture of everything in this set. It really doesn't have much, and I actually do like to use this sometimes, depending on the illustration. So I'm just going to go back to that color that I had originally. And with light pressure, that's what this brush looks like, brush 14, heavy pressure. And if I vary the pressure, it looks like that. So this brush doesn't have much texture within the line. There's a little bit of texture outside the line. So I actually do like to use this sometimes as a pencil for creating line work because it just has a little hint of texture, but not too much. And would I use it for coloring? Not so much. It doesn't have much texture, but if you want to color something with minimal texture, this is a good brush. It just has a little bit of texture on the outside. Okay, brush number 15. So this one is toothier. It's the same concept, it's thin and thick, but it's toothier, which means that there's more of the grain of the paper peeking through. So I'm going to show you with size 25, light pressure, heavy pressure. So even at heavy pressure, you're seeing a lot of the grain, which is a bit different from some of the other pencils we have. So keep that in mind that this one, you'll still see a lot of grain. And if I vary the pressure, it looks like that. So it's the same thing. I would use this for line art where I need to have a little bit of texture. And at a smaller size, I think it looks a little bit better. So that's this one. You can also use it for coloring too. I think this one's a little bit better for coloring because it actually has a nice texture. Then let's move on to brush number 16. So this has even more texture. It's a bit more grungy looking. So let me show you this, but it's the same concept. Light pressure, heavy pressure. Heavy pressure has a little less texture. And if you want it to become tapered, same thing. Start out heavy and then release the pressure as you move off the screen. And vary the pressure to create interesting lines like that. And what I like about this brush is that it has a little bit of different texture throughout the stroke depending on the pressure. So it's this interesting look. So you can also use this for coloring too. I think it's a little better than some of the previous brushes for coloring because you have this texture like that. So yeah, you can also use it for coloring. Now I'm going to go back to that example that I showed you earlier, this particular illustration. So I'm going to do the other side of this tree with this pencil, the one that I have right now, but I'm going to go back to that previous color. So I'm going to show you what that would look like. So I'm doing thin and thick lines. So do you see? It has a different texture. Even at this size, I'm zoomed out, you can definitely see the texture. I'm going to show you at the actual size. So actual size of what it would look like if it was printed. So both these brushes have different textures, so they will impact your illustration, especially if you use the brush throughout. It definitely makes a difference. So pick the one that suits your illustration the most. Personally, I think for this illustration, the left side suits it better. So I think that was brush number 13. Yeah, I think brush number 13 works better for this illustration, but brush 16, which we're currently on, gives it a different vibe. So it's up to you which one you choose. Now let's go to brush 17, which is Grungy Thin and Thick Pencil B. Whenever there's an A and a B, similar, slightly different texture. So I'm going to go back to that gray, and this is light pressure. This is heavy pressure. This one, what's interesting is that it has texture not only in the line, but there's also that bumpy texture kind of outside the line. And this one, depending on how much pressure you apply, you can get really grungy, blobby looks. So this one, I do suggest to avoid really high pressure. I think with really high pressure, it looks too blobby. With lighter pressure and medium pressure, it looks more natural. You can also go down in size. If you're someone who tends to use high pressure, just go down in size. And even at high pressure, it looks more natural. You can also use this for coloring. I'm going to go up in size. It would look like that. So slightly different from this, especially because the edges have a bit more texture. So as you can tell, all the brushes are somewhat similar, but they are slightly different. It's mainly the texture within the line and outside the line. So the one you use will depend on your illustration and your stylistic preferences. Okay, we're getting through this set. Now let's move on to the next category. So we're going to turn off the thin and thick pencils layer. Then we're going to tap on soft pencils, make sure it turns blue, and turn on the layer. So these are the soft pencils, which means that they have less grain than the toothy ones. So the soft pencils are what I would use for coloring. So far what we've talked about, those pencils I would use mainly for line art, not so much for coloring, also for sketching, but these are designed for coloring. So let's go into the brush library and let's tap on brush 18, soft pencil A. And because this is meant for coloring, we don't need to use gray anymore now. We can use some colors. So pick any color of your choice, ideally a mid-value, nothing too light, because I find that when you're testing brushes, if you test with a very light color, you can't tell the difference. They all kind of look the same because you can't see the texture as much. Let me show you what I mean. So if I use a really light blue, I can't even see it. It's too light. So you need to have something that's not too dark, but something in between. That's a good color. Okay, so let's zoom in. I am using this at size 10. So this brush is pressure sensitive for sure. And it's also tilt sensitive. So this is light pressure. I still see the grain of the paper, but it's not too much, not like the toothy pencils. Now, if I use heavier pressure, the color is slightly darker, very slight, not a huge amount, slightly darker. And if I tilt my pencil, we talked about tilt in part 1, it looks like that. So you can create different looks from the same brush just by varying pressure and tilt. Now, with this brush, if you are coloring something in and you want there to be less of that grain peeking through, just go over, see I'm going over the same area, and it will reduce the amount of grain of the paper that you see. And you can go over it again, like that. But it's still somewhat textured. It's not completely flat. So remember when I talked about brush 14, if you color with this, the color is completely flat. That doesn't happen with brush number 18. You can keep layering it. It will still have a little bit of texture. So keep that in mind. So I'm going to go back here. And with this pencil, when you're coloring, I suggest that you color in at a smaller size and then fill it in like this. It looks far more natural. Do you see? Now, if I color it in at a larger size, size 100, it looks like that. So that's completely different. That's a nice look too, but that's not the intended result. So I think with a lot of these pencils, if you go too big, it just does not look like a pencil anymore. It's still an interesting texture, there's nothing wrong with it, but it's not the intended result. So keep that in mind. If you want that intended result, something that looks like colored pencil, something that looks like natural media, try to avoid using really, really big sizes. So at a smaller size 5, it looks far more like a colored pencil. And at every size, it will look slightly different. So that's the beauty of it. At every size and how you apply the pressure, it will look a bit different. Okay, let's talk about brush 19. So brush 19 is soft pencil B, similar concept to soft pencil A, just a different texture. So I'm going to show you at size 20. So this is light pressure. This is heavy pressure. With heavy pressure, this does become a bit thicker. So it's a bit different from the other pencils, so keep that in mind. So every pencil is slightly different in terms of how it responds to pressure. So I'm using medium pressure here. So that's what that texture would look like. And if you want to go over it again, you most certainly can. It will look like that. You would need to go over this several times, maybe 3 or 4 times, before it becomes completely flat. So this one is definitely a little bit of a different texture than the soft one. This is the softest pencil by far. This one is soft, but not that soft. And it's very easy to layer it so that you will get very little texture if that's the look you're going for. And this one's also tilt sensitive. So if I tilt my pencil, it will look like that. So that is soft pencil B. Then we have soft pencil C, similar concept. So this is light pressure. Just going to show you I'm at size 25. This is heavy pressure. And super heavy pressure, you will have minimal texture. There will be some texture on the edges. Now, if I color with this one using medium pressure, it will look like that. And with tilt, it looks like that. So the tilt for this one is quite different from the other 2 brushes. So here, brush 18 with the tilt look like this. And brush 19 with the tilt look like this. This one looks like this when you tilt it. So I would say that brush 18 has the most texture so far out of the 3. Brush 19 has a little bit less texture. Brush 20 also has less texture. So it depends on what you like. So some people prefer a little less texture, then go with brush 20. If you want a little bit more, go with brush 18. So sometimes the brushes, it's all about finding which one feels better to you. And with brush 19, it is pressure sensitive, like the size of the brush really changes as you apply more pressure, which you don't see as much with 18 and 20. So they're all slightly different. And if you're sometimes confused about what the difference between the brushes is, because depending on the size, they can all start to look a bit similar, just go to a slightly larger size, not too large, and go with black and you'll be able to see the difference. So let me show you 18, 19, and 20 with black in a slightly larger size, and you'll be able to see the difference a lot better. So I'm going to zoom into the corner and show you, we'll do a comparison. So 18, let's go with size 25. And so that's what that looks like. Then 19, size 50, oops. That's what that looks like. And I'm using medium to light pressure for all of this. And then 20, size 60. That's what that looks like. So right now it's far easier to tell the difference. 20 has the least texture, 19 somewhere in the middle, and it looks more dry. And then 18 looks a little bit softer, and there's a lot of difference between the grays and the blacks, right? You see a lot more color variation there. Here you see a lot more of the tooth of the paper. So when you're confused, just go with a slightly larger size, use black, and then compare the brushes. You'll be able to tell the difference a lot better. And sometimes it's just about finding the one that feels right to you. Okay, so 21, let's move on. Let's go back to this color that we had. So with 21, I'm going to use size 30. So this is light pressure. Now I'm going to use heavy pressure. So as you can tell, it is pressure sensitive. The grain changes as well as the size of the lines. And if I color with this with medium to light pressure, that's what it will look like. And if I use really heavy pressure, you will get minimal texture. So again, with a lot of these brushes, it's important to use light to medium pressure. Really heavy pressure will result in something that has minimal texture. And also tilt. This is what it looks like with tilt. This is actually one of my favorite ones. It kind of has almost like a dotty texture, which I really like. So I would say from these so far, I would say from the soft pencils, I really like 18 and 21. Sometimes I'll use 20 and 19, but I generally prefer to use 18 and 21. It's a preference. So you might also have a preference. Depends on your style. I just wanted to give you options. So now let's go on to brush 22, soft pencil E. I'm going to go with size 35, and this is light pressure. As you can tell already, the texture of this is very different. And then heavy pressure, this is very pressure sensitive. You definitely get a much thicker line. And then if I color in with this, I'm using light to medium pressure. That's what it looks like. And if I use super heavy pressure, which I don't suggest you do, you will only get the texture on the edges and not in the center. So this one has a different texture. It kind of picks up the texture of the paper. So this one is kind of similar to, I would say, more like oil pastel in terms of its texture. I've seen the oil pastel on certain pieces of paper that look like this. So it's not like a traditional coloring pencil. It is a little bit different from a traditional coloring pencil, but hey, we're doing digital art, so we can do things a little bit differently and we can play around with different textures. So this is not a traditional colored pencil. It really is a little bit different because of that texture of the paper. Typically, you wouldn't use this kind of textured paper for pencils. You would use it for other media, but I wanted to add it because I thought it was a bit fun. I think it's really nice to paint something with this. Like, for example, if you're painting a sweater on an animal in your illustration, that would be a nice one to use. So anyway, these are all softer pencils, which means that they don't have too much tooth of the paper. And these are great pencils for laying down the base colors of your shapes. So for example, let me show you what I mean. So if I have an illustration, actually, let's just go to this one. And you can color in with this one with light to medium pressure. I'm just doing this quickly so you can see what it would look like. So you can try this with any coloring page that you have, and you'll be able to really see the difference when you use it for a shape. So do you see, you really see that texture of the paper, and you can always go over it again if you want one area to have less of that texture. The more you apply pigment, you'll lose some of that texture. Now, if I used a different brush, let's say I used soft pencil A, same color, it's a bit too big, and colored in, I'm going to show you what that would look like. So when you zoom out, you can tell the difference still. And when you zoom in, you see it even more. So as you can tell, there is quite a bit of a difference between the two. And you will see that difference even more if you do an entire illustration with one pencil over the other. That's when you can really tell the difference between the pencils. So yeah, that is the soft pencils. And now let's move on to toothy pencils. So I'm going to go to the layers panel. I'm going to turn off the soft pencils layer. I'm going to tap on toothy pencils, make sure it turns blue, and then turn that layer on by tapping on that check box. So the toothy pencils, there are 4, and I talked about the toothy pencils in part 1. I showed you how to use them in the clipping bath, so I'm not going to repeat that here, but in this particular video, today's video, I'm just going to go through the toothy pencils and what they would look like on their own. But I highly suggest watching part 1 and watching the part about the clipping masks. So let's go into the toothy pencils. So the toothy pencils, as you can see just from the images here, they have more of the grain of the paper peeking through. So toothy pencil A, I'm going to zoom in, and this is light pressure. I'm on size 40. I go really light, it looks like this. Yeah. And this is heavy pressure. So even with heavy pressure, you see a lot of the white of the paper peeking through. So this is a bit different from the soft pencils, because with the soft pencils, if you use heavy pressure, you're seeing very minimal texture. So with this, if you tilt, it will look like that. So you even see more of the paper peeking through. So you can either color with this on its own or use it in a clipping mask layer to add more texture to an existing base shape. So now let's move on to brush 24, Toothy Pencil B. So similar concept. It's quite toothy. So this is, I'm going to show you at size 20. So this is light pressure. This is heavy pressure. And I'll go up in size. So light, heavy. So a lot of the paper is showing through, but it's a little bit different, the texture. And then this is if you tilt it, you get that kind of texture. So compared to 23, you've got more of the white of the paper peeking through in a slightly different texture. So depending on your illustration, you may pick one over the other. Now let's go to Toothy Pencil C, brush 25. So this is at size 20, light pressure, heavy pressure. So this one with the heavier pressure, you're seeing less of the tooth of the paper. And then if I tilt it, it looks like that. I'm going to show you the larger size so you can really see the difference. So sometimes seeing the difference between the brushes, it's easier at a larger size. So this is if I color it in with medium pressure. So that's kind of what the grain looks like, which is different from this grain and different from this one. So they're all toothy, which means there's a lot of the white of the paper peeking through. It's just different texture. And then we have Toothy Pencil D. So I'm going to show you the larger size so you can really see the difference. So this is size 50. Light pressure. Do you see a lot of the paper? Heavy pressure. So this one, I would say you see the paper the most. Now, if you lay down your pigment and you feel like, oh, too much of the paper is peeking through, but I like this texture, just lift your pencil and lay down some more pigment. And keep going until you find something that you like. So if I were to color a heart with this, it would look like that. So quite toothy. So quite toothy. Now I could add a little bit more pigment here to add a little bit more definition on the edges. So let me show you an example of where I would use this. So I'm just going to go here, and I already have an illustration that I made. I made it with a gouache set. And let me just turn off this layer that was not meant to be there. So I made this with my messy gouache set. Now let's say I wanted to add a little bit more texture to the mushroom stalk. I could do that with one of the toothy pencils. So I'm going to talk about this particular mushroom stalk here. So let me find where it is. So I think it's here. So I'm just going to add a layer above it. And I'm going to grab the color from the mushroom stalk. I'm going to make it a little bit darker so it's more visible to you guys. And I'm going to use Toothy Pencil D. It's a bit too dark. I'll go a little bit lighter. And as you can see, with the Toothy Pencil, here I'm just adding a little bit of texture. So if I zoom out, you can see that for sure. And you can make it a bit darker too. So I really like to use pencils along with other media. So it's up to you. You can definitely combine different brush sets together. So this is something which I like to do. So you can always paint with something else for your base shapes and then add colored pencil on top, or you could paint everything with colored pencil. So this is an example of what I would do. Let me show you maybe another example and a slightly different illustration. So let's say I go to this fox. So this fox was done with watercolor, digital watercolor, not traditional. And let's say I wanted to add a little bit more texture to the head of this fox with one of the Toothy pencils. Maybe not Toothy Pencil D, I think it's a little bit too much. I could go with Toothy Pencil A and go down in size. And let's grab the color of the fox. Maybe make it a bit darker, test it out. Maybe a little bit darker, yeah. And then what I can do is just add a few lines with the pencil to add additional texture. Do you see? It's very subtle, but it did add a little something. So that is something that you can do with any media of your choice. Finish your painting with it and then come back with colored pencils and add a little bit more. I could do the same thing with the branches here. I could grab the color of the branch, maybe make it a little bit darker, and then add a little bit of additional texture on top of these branches. So what I like to do is mix it up. So you definitely don't have to do your entire illustration with pencils if that's not your thing. You can always mix it up and add it to other things. You can also just use pencils on its own, like what I would do here as a coloring page. For example, let's say I wanted to paint this girl's coat in red. I could do it with another pencil first. So let's see, I can go in with one of the soft pencils and color in her coat. So that's just me coloring it in. So you can try this out with any coloring page that you have. So I have the base shape down. And then if I want to add a little bit more texture to this base shape, I can go in the slightly darker color and pick one of the toothier pencils, like maybe toothy pencil B, and then just go on top of it and add a little hint of texture like that. I should have gone with a smaller size, it's a bit too big. So yeah, the size definitely makes a big difference. And as you can see now, I have a very different texture compared to what I had with the other pencil. So yeah, you can tell her coat has some texture to it. So it depends on your illustration, depends on your style, depends on what you're painting. So mix it up. Use the pencils on your own, use them with some other sets as well, and have some fun. So for today, I think we are done. I don't want to overwhelm you with so much. So we stopped at the, oops, the wrong thing. We stopped at the toothy pencils. So in the next part, we will cover layerable pencils, damp pencils, dual color, fill brushes, detail pencils, and the erasers and smudgers. I hope this was useful. If you enjoyed it, please do give it a thumbs up. And I will see you in the next video. We will talk about the rest of the brushes. Thank you very much for watching. Bye.